It was kind of taking a bit of a chance on my behalf on a recent rainy Melbourne day when I messaged today's guest to say, hey, do you want to be on the show? His very efficient, friendly and ever so helpful assistant, Belinda, got right back to me and set it all up. So how lucky am I to be sharing the 3WBC studios with footy legend Cameron Schwab today. Not ordinarily commemorated for his on-field achievements, but for one of the many who work tirelessly behind the scenes and reaching the spotlight only when things aren't going so well. Cameron Schwab is an outstanding business leader who transformed the fortunes of AFL clubs Richmond, Melbourne and Fremantle. It only took him 25 years, and he's the youngest person in the game to be appointed CEO and the second longest serving in the role. His natural leadership talents combined with strong academic qualifications have seen him take on some of the sporting world's most difficult and daunting challenges. In the process, he has established a track record of building teams and organisations and unifying groups while navigating periods of genuine adversity and complexity. Now, it's not often you'll find such an accomplished leader who's also well known for his sensational storytelling, amazing artistry and creative writing. Well, Cameron Schwab is absolutely all that when it comes to life and living. And here he is with me right now, just gagging to paint what's sure to be an exquisite picture of what it feels like being Cameron Schwab.
Well, thank you.
Oh, God, I'm going now. I'm leaving.
I don't quite know how to respond to all that. But, yeah. I suppose when you get to... I'm 59 now, so I suppose when you... There's just a reflection of years as much as anything, isn't there? There's just the layers of stuff that you've had the experience and the opportunity of doing and being a part of, and various changes we make along the way and various opportunities we step into and those that we probably choose not to, and probably a lot of what I stepped into was already been stepped into by people before me in regard to family and fair history in the game, which is something I was very pleased to have had the opportunity to do, and certainly proud of my family's association with the game of Australian footy.
Well, you just mentioned you're 59. 59?
Yeah.
And so you stepped in seriously at 24. I know you were doing some things before then.
Yeah.
But was way back in 1988 that you were appointed CEO of the famous Richmond Football Club.
Yeah.
24 years. So it's like a lifetime.
No,
if you do the maths on that, people. Now, you're the youngest person in history and you were picked. I'm sure that there were other people who had more experience than you. Why were you picked?
Well, maybe they didn't want the job. It might have been that. I'd grown up with the game, so I grew up. My father, Alan Schwab, was secretary of the Richmond Football Club, which is the same title, just it's almost title inflation,
Old
if you
school,
like.
yeah.
And in many ways, I think the title should still be secretary, because it is a little bit different to your traditional CEO role, because you're running a sporting club, and which by definitions are not for profit, but obviously they're not necessarily massive organisations in the context of number of employees, but they're big organisations in regard to their footprint, and they're getting bigger all the time, obviously. When I was still at school, and a job when I was in year 12, a job was advertised in the old Sun News Pictorial, I think it was called, and it was looking for an assistant to the football manager of the Melbourne Football Club. And it was the year that Ron Barassi had returned to Melbourne, and there was a lot of excitement and opportunity, it seemed, there, and I spoke to my father about the role, and which was also complicated a little bit that my parents had recently separated at that time as well. So even having any form of discussion at that stage, there was layers embedded in it, and about applying for that role, just as as a post-school thing to do, perhaps before I go to uni at some stage. Or
had your family not had any discussions with you before that about what might be the next step?
not in a. I can't recall anything in a deep sense. I remember when you had to make certain subject choices and stuff like that. I had some thought I might want to be a physio, but actually the thing I was probably better at school coming through was art. I was my mum's an artist and I was always drawing but I never saw any career opportunities in that. I don't think anyone did, but that wasn't necessarily saying that you wouldn't do it for at least a period of your life, before you got serious about what it was.
And also back then with the arts, it was considered a thing you did after school or in addition to a proper career.
Yeah, it was. Although Mum being an artist, I saw that was a thing, So she worked full time as well, but she was a really accomplished, mainly landscape artist, and she's had exhibitions and that was something she took on a little bit later in life as well, because she had her first baby at 16, so Gosh. She had my sister at 16. So she didn't get much choice in terms of, she had 3 kids by the time she was 23, 24, and so it wasn't outside of it, but I really can't remember having any defined career direction other than I think an inkling at one point that I would perhaps do physiotherapy or something like that, something which was related to sport. It was an opportunity. I'd come to terms with my sporting mortality fairly young in life, that I knew that I wasn't going to be able to play it at any high level.
Why was that?
I just wasn't athletic enough. I wasn't talented enough. And I had a cousin, Peter Schwab, who ends up going on and playing close to 200 games, and he's 3 years older. So I understood his career trajectory in regard to, how good you had to be, if you like, to even get an opportunity. And I was miles from that.
No, I knew this conversation was going to go all over the place because questions just pop into my head all the time. So the first role you had was as a recruiter.
Yeah. So that's how it came about with, so I basically...
But can I just ask you a question? Sorry. If you didn't have the acumen or the talent or the skills or attributes to actually play the game, how were you so successful in being able to pick?
I tried hard to play the game. I just wasn't very good at it in the context of...
How were you able to pick players then in terms of recruiting?
I just studied it, yeah. Even going back a little bit further, remember the old show World of Sport used to be? Yeah, so it was
Bob
almost
Skelton.
like a Sunday ritual for, basically every Melbourne family. And so we'd sit in front of World of Sport and...
Sponsored by Hutton's Footy Franks.
Yeah, and all that, yeah. And it was just, I'd turn it on and I'd watch it all the way through, and there was a thing on it, the Handball Championship, and I knew a lot about, because I'd grown up around the game, I was regularly the silent person in a room where my father was talking to the great Richmond coach Tommy Hafey about why they'd won and lost the game the day before as secretary of Richmond. So, and they'd be saying things and they'd be talking to each other, and I never watched the games with Dad because he was working, but a great fellow by the name of Barry Cameron, who was almost a second father figure to me growing up, and his son Craig Cameron's my closest mate. So I'd gone to the game, so I just stood in the outer, and they'd be replaying the games to each other and talking about events in the game, and I'd look at it and I'd go, I remember that bit. And they weren't just talking about, the greatness of the players. They were talking about all aspects of it. So I was getting this 10,000 hours of football education really young in life. And then on World of Sport one day, Kevin Sheedy, who was playing at that time, he won the handball championship or whatever it was on that day. And he'd handballed in a way which the old timers didn't handball. He'd basically reinvented the way you handball the ball, and it then became the Kevin Sheedy rocket. And I remember after it went back to the panel, they said, that Kevin Sheedy, he's a student of the game. And I remember looking at that thinking, that's what I want to be. I want to be a student of the game. I didn't think there was any future in it. But so I reckon I'd always studied it. I had my own scrapbooks, my own notebooks. I'd pick Richmond teams before... and then the Friday mornings you get the Herald Sun or the Sun, and you'd look at the teams, and I'd be shitty that they hadn't picked the players that I wanted to pick, and it was all of that stuff. And I literally would analyse it within each of its life from that point onwards. I think it was the coming together of some of the more analytical aspects of probably who I am, and just the pure passion for the sport, and particularly the Richmond Football Club.
Do you think you were influenced by your dad, or do you think that was just a natural, it was a deep-seated love and passion?
Yeah, it was. I can't think of any part of myself without it. It's like.
Did your sister? Did she fall down the footy
No, not so much. I think it was probably hardest for her because she's my older sister, Jenny, and then there's two boys,
Yes.
and we did, and both of us have made our career in sport, basically. Jen's she's a primary school teacher who has had this massive influence on my life in another way, mainly through music and probably the art, and who I just love deeply. Had probably the hardest time. One, her mother was only 16 when she had her, so there's just that element is that complication, if you like. Although Mum was remarkable, really, and then the flavour of our family was just so football obsessed. Yeah. And
was it something that you could use as currency at school, like lording over the other kids?
Yeah, not so much. I grew up as a son of, so there's always that complexity of having someone where you're known for something other than who you are. There was that aspect of it, but I was so proud of that I wore it like a badge of honour anyway. But I never really held it over people. I think people understood that perhaps I had a slightly more colourful life than, in some ways, than most did. That we would have players around our house a lot, and we'd have. If the team, we lived in Mount Waverley when we played at Waverley Park or the old VFL Park in the day, there would be after-match functions back at our place, so the players would be around at our house. We had one of those, 4-foot Clark rubber pools in the backyard, and in our sort of little quarter acre block, which has probably now got 5 units on it or something like that in Mount Waverley. And there was a famous Richmond player by the name of Brian Roberts, who they called the Whale. Well, he actually got the Whale nickname in our backyard because he jumped into our backyard pool, and we had every urchin from our neighbourhood in that backyard pool, and he basically washed them all out of the pool. The mass of his body and I can't remember what the science. When the water is replaced by a solid object or whatever it was.
Yeah.
It was So all of that was very much. It was a colourful but relatively complex upbringing in that sense, and because I was just so much in love with the game, I felt so privileged, really, and I don't think it was ever anything that I saw myself as being anything special, but I certainly saw my father as being special.
Yeah.
In fact, I probably thought myself as less than special because I almost, in some ways, there was always, a comparison between myself and how I saw his world, and perhaps even from the early days, maybe a desire to want to fit into that in one way or another, as complex as it was.
Because did you actually get to see the world, or did you just see fragments of it when he came home, or you?
I saw the best and worst of it. Yeah. No, there were times I saw its underbelly, even as a young age, and I know that because I saw the impact that it would potentially have on my dad, my father's relationship with my mum, some of the choices and decisions Dad had to make in regard to the lives of other people, trading players, retiring players, some of the cutthroat elements of elite sport, which Richmond of that era, Richmond was known as Ruthless Richmond, and they had a number of sort of ruthless personalities. I always found it hard to reconcile that mindset with Dad, but clearly he had it. But probably the role he played at Richmond was maybe a little bit more picking up the pieces of other people's pure ruthlessness in regard to it. There were some very strong figures around the club, larger-than-life personalities.
Did you bring that with you when you were stepping into the role at such a young age, knowing that that's what you're kind of signing up for a little too?
Yeah, no, I understood that, and I think we're all a little bit of a mosaic of, the people who directly influenced us, but also our observations of those who, they were within touch of me, and I had that because as I was saying, I ended up at the Melbourne Football Club. My first boss was Ron Barassi,
Get out.
So it was.
What was that like? Ron Barassi back then being your boss,
really. Like it was. You did walk on eggshells around him, but he was unbelievably loving and caring person, and that's the thing that I remember him most for. I talk about it now, even in terms of the leadership work that I do, that I think people would look at a Barassi figure, or particularly those strong figures of that era, as people who would seek to extract performance from people, as in, push, shove, yell, scream, all the versions of that. But the great leaders I always found were those who unlock performance in people. They find something in them that they didn't realise they had themselves. And you asked about recruiting, how I found myself in that. Well, I was basically, because I had my love of music, mainly through my sister Jenny, that I used to make a heap of mixtapes. You just edit tapes out all the time, and excuse me. And I was watching Barassi coach the team at one point, and he was doing, it was a team meeting. He had a video going. If the meeting went for an hour and a half, I reckon an hour of it was Ron fast forwarding and rewinding the tape just to find the spot that he was seeking to coach and give the player feedback. And I was watching this because my job was to set up the meeting, put the television and put the video up and get it all ready to go, just as an 18-year-old. And my job description was pretty much do anything Ron Barassi asked me to do, and it might be the best job description I've ever had. But in watching this, I remember going to him afterwards and saying, look, I think I can edit your tapes out for you. And he just gave me the video. He gave me this foolscap sheet of paper with the thing that he was coaching to, the 10 or 11. And I went home. I went to a place called Tandy Electronics. I bought like a video out of my own money. I remember buying a video cassette and the cords to connect it. I took the video player from the footy club and I took it home. I was still living at home at the time. And I connected it up to our own video and I edited out his tapes. And I took it in to him the next day. It took me till about 4 o'clock in the morning.
Was that like tape to tape?
Tape to tape, yeah. And it was exactly the same, I realised, as the mixtapes when you used to tape songs off the radio and that type of thing. And he played it, he put it into the video and played it, and he looked at me like I was a freaky genius, that I'd done something remarkable.
You were.
Yeah. And so I then pretty much did that for the next 5 years of editing out his tapes and he'd give me a foolscap sheet of paper, and they just kept getting longer and longer and longer.
Is foolscap still a thing?
Yeah, it was. It still make it's all A4 now.
Not when I go to the printer on my on my computer. There's no option for foolscap.
No, probably isn't. And so you have this opportunity all of a sudden that I'm now in daily conversation at a fairly technical level with the most influential voice in the game, and that's Ron Barassi during that era. And he then, you asked about recruiting. Every so often I'd put forward something to him. I'd say, look, I think there was another part of this game where something you've been coaching to was also there. And he'd just say, oh, look, put it on it. And he'd actually called it the mixtape, put it on the mixtape. And I'd be watching him coach to the piece of play that I'd identified. And I'm like 18 or 19 at this point.
How did that feel?
It just was so, and I was the only person in the room who knew that was happening. But it was, it was joyous almost.
Is that something you could tell your dad?
Yeah, and I talked to him about it. Yeah, I talked to him about it. And then about a year later, he was in conversation. There was a couple of other strong figures around the footy club at that time. A guy by the name of Ray Jordan, who was a famous under-19 and reserves coach, junior coach. A guy by the name of Barry Richardson, who was chairman of selectors, who was a great Richmond player and also knew Dad very well. I remember them talking. It was at a meeting just at match committee, saying that the club needs to put more resources into recruiting, and because we're getting left behind. But the club had no money at the time, and I heard my name come up in conversation. I was sort of half listening, and they said, "Oh, why don't we get young Cameron to go and do some recruiting, see if he's got an idea for it." And so they basically saw something in me I'd never seen in myself, and I went recruiting. And I remember going to Adelaide at one stage. I actually drove to Adelaide because we had no money to watch games, and I was watching a Sturt game.
I thought you'd spent all your money on the video.
On the video, yeah. I was watching a Sturt game, and I came back and said, I think there's a player here we should be really serious about recruiting, but he hasn't played much football. He was a tennis player growing up, and Barassi backed my judgment in on that player, and I'll never forget that, because I reckon he struggled with the story, as in the player who hadn't played much football and we should spend a lot of money getting him, but he was prepared to back my judgment. and the player was Todd Viney, and who played 260 odd games for the D's, and his son's now vice captain, who I got to sign the two of them, which was a great thing. And so, and I'd almost say, without question, the majority of career progression I've had is when people have seen something in me I hadn't seen in myself, and that was the Richmond scenario. So when
can you just say that again?
When people see something in me that I'd never seen in myself.
And I just wanted you to repeat that just in case anyone missed it, because I think we miss it in ourselves all the time. We're always looking outward, wondering what people are thinking about us. And we're trying to get feedback from people, not really understanding what the total sum of them are. So how could we expect to be able to get that insight for ourselves? So thank you for indulging me in that, Cameron.
No worries. And I think our natural inclination is to be fairly straight line in regard to ambition as well. We just look up the hill. We don't necessarily look at another hill. And that's a time, because they said, "Oh, look, we think you should go recruiting." Well, that wasn't something which I'd thought of, because I actually liked being around the team and the players, and being in recruiting meant that you weren't that, because you were off somewhere else. And so I remember thinking, is that the sideways step I want to take? But if not for the power of the voices, but I also knew enough, because Dad, as Secretary of Richmond, was also the recruiter. That was a combined role really in those days, and I used to love the recruiting stories. When he'd drive up to the country and he'd come back, and he'd have he'd be all excited because he'd seen a player, and he'd tell me about the player, and straight away my imagination is this player running around for the Tigers in a few years' time, and one of the great Richmond players, a fellow named Royce Hart, was a famous Tasmanian player, and I remember Dad saying, "Oh, he's going recruiting in Tasmania," and I said, "Oh, you're going to bring home another Royce Hart?" And he said, "Oh, you only get one of them in a lifetime." It was one of those moments. But he signed a guy by the name of Michael Roach, who was just a great Richmond player, kicked a lot of goals and played in a premiership, and one of the great Richmond players. And so and I got to see those stories come to life. The 16-year-old signing, and then 5 years later watching him run around on the MCG with the Premiership Cup.
And those names are still very much alive today.
Yeah,
in
the
fabric.
Much,
yeah,
very powerful. So even the Richmond thing was basically a guy by the name of Paddy Ganane, who was on the board at Richmond, who was a great Richmond player and influential person around the club. I was at a game I was watching it at the Junction Oval, and just recruiting wise for Melbourne, I think it was a school game, and Paddy was a big figure, like he's about 6'4" and big, strong looking guy, and he almost loomed over me, and he used to often come up and talk to me about recruiting, and then halfway through the conversation he said, would you think about coming back to Richmond, or coming over to Richmond? I'd never been to Richmond, other than being a kid there with my dad, and I assumed he wanted me to do the recruiting, but the fact that it was Richmond, I wouldn't have been able to move just to do the same role. But he said, no, we think, and the role was called general manager in those days. It wasn't called CEO. Yeah. He said, no, we're thinking we'd like you to be the general manager. And I couldn't believe it, really. I thought that it might be something I'd get to do at some stage.
Because you'd not been to university at this stage.
No, I'd gone straight from school. I'd worked in footy for 6 years, all at Melbourne. The year before they approached me, Melbourne went from pretty much bottom to making a finals, and it was a famous game where Jimmy Steins ran over the mark, and they missed out on getting in the grand final. Robbie Flowers last year. And so it become quite a storied thing, and the story was then, where did the players come from? And I'd been the person who'd played probably the majority role in accumulating a team which for Melbourne made the finals for the first time in 23 years. So it was a big breakthrough year for the club. And so and also obviously my surname's Schwab, so whatever, and my cousin was playing for Hawthorn as well, and he was a premiership player at Hawthorn. And so I think all of that accumulated into, and I've got no doubt also that Dad was then executive commissioner of the AFL, and I've got no doubt they're thinking, well, if we get the young bloke to do it, we're going to get a fair bit of Alan Schwab as well. So there was a lot of circumstance in it.
Yeah.
But then they actually approached me. Then I have to go through the more formal aspects of it. I'd never seen a balance sheet in my life. I'd never seen a profit and
I
loss
was going
statement
to say,
in my
what
life.
prepared you for this? So in general management suggests...
Yeah, it was...
General.
Well, you're running the footy club, really.
Yeah.
And Richmond was a very different club to the one that Dad had been involved with. They were last on the ladder at the time. They were broke, like seriously broke. And it was at a time of, interest rates are through the roof and the club's got a lot of debt. And I remember looking at the balance sheet for the first time in front of a group of people, and I was trying to pretend I knew what I was looking at. I literally was. But I knew enough that if there was red ink on the page, that was probably the thing you talk about. So that's all, and that's what I did. And I knew by the sort of the furrowed brows and the red ink that, the club wasn't in good shape, and they certainly weren't in good shape on field. And it'd been a mighty fall because they'd won the premiership in 1980, and this is 1988. So they've gone from being the most powerful club in the competition to the weakest in that period. But the one thing which you always understood was that Richmond's a big beast. That it was only a little bit of success away from filling the MCG again. And so that was the excitement, but the fact that it was Richmond was the main thing. But I did remember ringing my dad, who he would have been all over it, I've got no doubt, and saying, look, I'm not sure it's a very good job, and for all the reasons. And he said to me, if it was a very good job, they wouldn't be asking you. But he said it it was not in any negativity at all. Yeah. He said, because others, they would have gone to others before they've gone to you. You don't go to a 24-year-old to put a fair whack of your future in their hands. And so my assumption is there was probably other people they had in mind, but
maybe the balance sheet couldn't afford.
Yeah, and that might be it.
That
might have been part of it. They were probably going to get a relatively cheap CEO. But it was also, because it's interesting, because then there's been other times in life where I have put my hands up for roles and haven't been selected, and trying not to personalise that, and because I'd actually had to regularly make choices on one person versus another person for the next period of my life, even as a recruiter, I had to say it was a draft, so we draft this person here or we don't draft that person. And as often it's very marginal in terms of what you're looking at. And I then had this mindset that was, well, the fact that they haven't selected me doesn't mean I wouldn't do a good job. I had, and so knowing that at that stage they'd selected me, and it might have been very marginal, me versus whoever the next candidate was. That's right. Yeah.
Well, it's completely subjective, isn't it, to so many things.
Particularly in recruiting. And it wasn't like I had to do 10 interviews or anything like that. It was actually a relatively, I think I might have had 2 conversations, 2 meetings or something like that. It wasn't, now if you go for a CEO role, you're likely to have, every form of profiling, testing, a million resume checks and reference checks, all that sort of stuff. That certainly wasn't the case in those days.
Well, Cameron, you've already chewed up 30 minutes of time. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But you're a tiger, so tigers do that. So we do need to go to a break. But I just wanted to, in front of me, I have your beautifully illustrated, photographed, written book called More to the Game, which is what leaders can learn from football, which you've produced just recently?
No, that's a couple of years old now, yeah.
Well, that's recently, because you take COVID out of that, and that's just yesterday, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I've been reading bits and pieces of what you've been writing, and I just wanted to, before we go to the break, just read something that sort of really encapsulates your love of the game and something that you wrote. I fell in love with the Tigers before I fell in love with anything else in my life. I fell in love with the game, the Tigers, holding my father's hand. I am 7 years old, walking up the steps of the old Olympic stand at the MCG, hand in hand with my dad. It's in colour, I say aloud. Dad laughs and pulls me closer. Until that day, I'd only seen the game in black and white on our small TV at home. He'd tell that story for years. Love that.
Keep it teary hearing it.
I'm going to get you to cry. It's my job in life. Something to make you smile, because we have come to our first break in the show. And this is where I prepare us to play our very first special guest song request. So here it goes. Now, I'm going to give you a cryptic clue to help you announce your first song. So you ready for it?
Yeah.
Could have to do with the title, could have to do with the artist. Often found in an engagement ring.
Neil Diamond.
Correct.
Yep.
Well done. Was that difficult, do you think?
No.
Should have made that harder.
Yeah,
So Neil Diamond, and the song is actually I Am, I Said. What does that mean for you?
Neil Diamond was almost the theme of my childhood. Hot August Night, crunchy granola sweet. We had one of those quadraphonic, big box stereo systems, which got me through most of my schooling, to be honest. But I think Hot August Night was probably the album played on it more than anything. And the choice of I Am, I Said, I'll talk about when we come
back. In fact, that's inspired me to get that up on my as a Spotify playlist. Anyway, when we come back, we are going to talk about that and continue on the path of young Cameron, and keep walking toward where it's all wound up to now. So we could be here for quite some time. You're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC. Don't go away. To 94.1 FM, it's 3WBC with Rae Bonney and Cameron Schwab. He's the youngest club CEO in Victorian Football League history. And if you've just joined us now, we were just speaking all about that. And I do have a couple of shout outs to give. First one is David Willett. Thanks for tuning in, David, all the way from Doncaster East. And what did he's very worried about Carlton. He's a Carlton supporter, and he's worried about them, and he's all tuned in. Thanks, David. And also Mark Brown, all the way from Dubai. We have listeners from all over the world. So thanks for tuning in, guys. So, Cameron, you had a little bit more to say about Neil Diamond and I Am, I Said.
Yeah, no, it was definitely the most played album. Hot August Night. I think the start of Hot August Night is actually as good a start as there is to an album over, with the just the build up.
The build up.
Yeah, but I Am, I Said. I love storytelling, and the one thing, it's amazing voice too. That's the thing which also resonates when you hear it. Might be just in the studio, just the vibration of the voice. But it was a song we played at my father's funeral. Yeah, so it has. It certainly brings back. Yeah, I don't find it a sad song. I find it quite joyous, and because my memory of Dad's love of that song was he had this somewhat annoying habit that he couldn't sing. So what he would do was he would say the words before the words came up. So he'd speak the words, before the actual, Neil Diamond would
narrate them,
belt it out, and it was particularly if you might have a little glass of scotch in his hand or something like that, and he'd talk them through, and he was word perfect on them. And so, but it's also mum and dad and relative. What I looked at as sort of happy suburban times, but I also understand there's complexity in any relationships and times, but music was just such a big part of of our childhood and soundtrack and falling in love with various aspects of it. And but no, that's the song which all the songs I've chosen are about important relationships. And so that was my dad's one.
Yeah, well, I wanted to sort of draw a bit of a line between, well, not a line, but it's probably more a link around. I've been reading about your very your descriptive childhood, and how you paint a picture of this very uncertain, almost self-deprecating, shame child to being able to then become general manager of Richmond Football Club and so on. We can talk about all the blah, blah leadership and strategy stuff, but the real crux of it is you. So being able to illustrate these stories on paper, I think now I've got the privilege of you being able to actually talk to them in your own voice. So, but first though, your incredibly strong creative talents, because it's not just writing and it's not just drawing and it's not just music. It's all of these things that go in together. When did you first recognise that you had this? You mentioned your mum, of course, but
yeah, mum was a painter, so that was, but that happened a little bit later. So it wasn't necessarily something which was the reason why I did it. I don't think.
But you never felt the urge, like you didn't look at the world through a creative
always
lens.
Drawing though as a kid.
Okay.
Yeah, always drawing. So I remember, I think it was dinosaurs initially, then it was superheroes, then it was footballers, and my I still draw footballers, so more as an illustrative thing or trying to capture a moment in a game or something like that. But there's almost two forms to my art. The ones where I'm trying to say something and leaving enough space inside the drawing. And I got to study art full time. So I did, when I finished at Melbourne, I ended up at the Victorian College of the Arts and studied art full time. And I actually remember one of my lecturers saying, "You draw like a CEO." It was almost the ultimate put down. And in the conversation we had is that basically you're drawing in a way where you don't want anyone to interpret it as anything other than how you seek to have it interpreted. And he said the challenge will be for you to create enough space inside the work that you do for other people to see something in it that wasn't. And that was, and perhaps the fact that I was putting myself in such a different place, like 2 years earlier I was in boardrooms, now I'm in an art studio. It was like it couldn't have been any further. In an art studio, and then the next art studio is a whole lot of 18 and 19-year-olds who are doing first year fine art. And probably just that learning then came through in my writing as well. I'm telling a story, but I'm happy for you to interpret it how you want to, and I have to be comfortable with that. And I realise there is a layer of courage in one doing art and putting your art into the world. And the term is you've got to learn to ship your work. Like if you can't, there's one thing about doing it, but then there's another thing in terms of putting it out there.
In terms of getting to Victorian College of the Arts, was that always on your trajectory?
No, not really. I'd been sacked as CEO of Melbourne in 2013, but it was the second time I'd been sacked as a CEO, and the first time led to a very unhealthy response. Might have been going back to the childhood stuff that we talked about, and the second time recognising, and perhaps just being older, a bit more pragmatic about what the world offered. It literally happened where I thought, well, I might just see if I can explore it a little bit. And I remember getting on a tram. I went to a place, it was in Preston, called Northern College of the Arts and Technology, NCAT. And all I had was like a few moleskin notebooks with sketches and drawings in them. Because when I was CEO at Fremantle, I would often use that time between Perth and Melbourne just to draw. And so I had some stuff. I didn't have
on the plane.
Yeah. I didn't have like a folio or anything like that. But I realised if I was going to go into somewhere like Victorian College of the Arts, I'd have to have something more than my moleskin notebooks. And they had a course called folio prep, and I went out there and met some wonderful people, Tracy Patterson particularly, who just looked at my work and she knew who I was because she followed footy but didn't say anything the whole time. And I signed up for it, and I remember ringing my wife on the way back and said, "You wouldn't what I just signed a 12-month." And she said it was the most joy she'd heard in my voice for years. And that when she said that just meant the world. And I think probably was relief for her because she'd experienced my unhealthy response the first time I'd been sacked.
What was your unhealthy response?
Oh, clinical depression, yeah. Major clinical depression. And
how did you manage that?
Slowly, hard, with her love, probably. But probably I'm quite lucky that I don't have any classically addictive aspects to me. I'm not, although obviously there's other forms of addictions as well, but I'm not someone who's ever drunk a lot. I've never taken drugs. I'm not a punter. Just not because I've made clear choices on those things, just because it just hasn't been me. And
did you worry? I know that your dad had a reputation for liking the drink.
Yeah, Dad would have been diagnosed as an alcoholic.
Yeah. Did that worry you that you could go down that path?
Not really, because I just didn't get any joy from it. Or I didn't get any solace from it. I didn't, like all of us. I'm certainly not. I've had big nights out and done all those things and had lots of fun and done that, but I've never then yearned for it the next day or anything like that. I've been lucky like that. And Dad was also a punter as well. So there was aspects to him, but I don't think it was ever conscious, because it would have been easy because it was so normalised for it to be that. I just didn't. I think it's just luck. I don't think it was. I didn't have the gene.
The gene. Yeah.
And so then I probably because I'd had an established way of working. The one thing about the roles I had, you had to be good at work, as in how you get stuff done, how you achieve achieve's probably the wrong word, how you actually become good at something, if you like. And probably because I had that I'd developed that ethos over the previous 30 years, that my application to art meant that it sort of opened up fairly quickly, and I learnt new things, and then I was able to put together a folio. I did go to the Victorian College of the Arts. I only studied there for the 1 year, but it was in its own way enough, because it had given me what I needed. I was never looking for a degree, and to say that I'm, to say that I can do this, and I found probably the transition, and it's interesting when you think of yourself in the context of identity, I started calling myself an artist, rather than someone who does art or draws. And I now think of myself as an artist or a writer, and being okay with that definition. I'm a cyclist. I don't ride bikes.
Yes.
And it's interesting because the minute you become a parent, you think of yourself as a parent. You don't call yourself as someone who has children.
Yes.
Yeah. And even leaders, a lot of people say it's a hard thing to call yourself a leader, because there's layers inside that. And so the artist was. I was sorry.
No, I was just going to say it comes into my circle a lot, because I work with men, especially men of a certain style, who are very defined by, in Australia, what they do.
Yeah.
And when they're not doing what they do, for example, have been exited not by their own choice from the thing that they do, or the thing that they're defined for, is really, really difficult. And when I was reading one of your stories about your transition from a public school into a private school, of being a really young boy, I thought, wow, that's just another example. And not that I want to make this about men in particular, but boys who transition without maybe any guidance or any real clear pathway to what's supposed to be achieved from this massive transition.
Yeah, no, it is. Well, the who we are piece, our identity, has been embedded in life forever. Like you meet people whose surname's Butcher or Baker, or whatever. That's probably because there was a butcher and a baker in there somewhere. So we're always being clearly identified by what we do, and probably the change is that we aren't that thing for the rest of our life anymore.
We can be many things as well.
Yeah, and perhaps my first, all of a sudden I wasn't a CEO, and the interesting thing for most of my life, I didn't have to explain to people anything really. Most people kind of knew, that's what I was and that's who I am. And whereas now, for the first time in my life, because of the passage of time, that's not the case. And I sometimes struggle to explain who I am. It's not that I have any concern with that. It's just more coming up with the right words. And Although early days, even when I was CEO at Richmond, I tell you I'm CEO of Richmond Football Club, and they go, "Is that full time?" You know,
What are you
they'd
doing?
say that, you know, and
Yeah.
because it seemed such a part-time thing. You know,
Yeah.
footy was played on Saturday afternoons.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so, what are you doing on the other days? You know,
Yeah.
that's that type of thing. But the art thing was then. So the thing I learnt probably was courage. I would think, you know, that, and I love the idea of courage as a value or something to aspire to. But I also recognise it's a place we've got to work to. It's not, you don't land there. There are certainly some people who, by virtue of their personality, strength of personality, some circumstance, can land there quicker. But I find any form of resilience, and even when it comes to ideas of vulnerability and that type of thing, is normally a place you work towards, not a place you land. And probably just through life circumstances and even dealing with, you know, clinical depression when I was in my mid-30s at the time. I almost call it my gift of depression now, because I think a lot of the things what it taught me in the place I had to go to get better meant I found out so much more about myself, and that I could actually deal with this, and I was dealing with it mostly on my own, but with Cecily, my wife, who was remarkable in all of that. I don't think I would have stayed with me, because I wasn't bringing much joy to a relationship, that's for sure. But I'm glad she did, because we're now where we are, in a place where we can have joy together, because of, you know, the stuff that we've had to work through. And
in terms of clinical depression, though, you know, we have many different approaches to mental health, and I think a lot of our language and literature is very, very confusing and conflatist. And, you know, a lot of what I see with people, situational crisis can cause things like anxiety and depression, but based on a situation. And I look at your situation and how your career's gone, you're just stretched and stretched and stretched and continually like this. And then all of a sudden, I'm doing a bit of a visual demonstration here for Cameron listeners, but, you know, that snaps eventually, and then can cause symptoms of that look like depression and anxiety. So I'm sort of curious around, you know, was that part of your situation, part of the situational crisis and all the trauma you would have experienced? Like, even you told me a quick story the other night I think you were in Fremantle, and the game had finished, and there was a fan approaching you that you thought was going to just say g'day, but didn't say g'day, said something else.
No. Told me to F off back to Melbourne. Yeah, so it was... Yeah, I think there's no doubt there was elements of it where you're putting yourself under pressure, but I understood that in lots of ways, because I'd grown up with that. But I don't think it's until you experience it yourself. And I think there was also it was also an era where it was a bit of suck it up, and there's no doubt there's a lot of people who were responding in all forms of unhealthy ways to the layers and expectations that come with the role. But, you know, I think, you know, this conversation started a little bit with, I don't think I had natural... I did have self-esteem issues growing up, but again, not necessarily anything unusual. I think a lot of young people do, and it was, you know, the story you were referring, I think you were going to reference before, was I grew up in Mount Waverley, went to Essex Heights Primary School, 1,000 kids at the school, great school, and there was only a few of the kids who ever got to go to private schools, and I went to Campbell Grammar, and it was years later I asked my mum about that choice, and she said, I thought it might have been she recognised some form of academic or, you know, some capability in me, and I was going okay at school. I was I was probably top of the second, third, if you like. You know, you always did okay, but not because I could never match it with work rate, but probably there was enough genetics. My mum and dad are both very bright people, and her answer was, look. And my hope was that it was because she'd seen something in me, but she basically said, look, we could see you going either way, was her response. And it was recognising probably there's only so far she could take that as a parent in regard to that. And so we went to Campbell Grammar. It used to take me about an hour and a half to get to school. And it was a long way. It was a train and a tram and a fair walk. And
horse and cart probably back in those days.
Yeah, it was a bit that. But then what it did was it put me into these two different things. I still had my mates from my local neighbourhood, but then who had nothing like the school expectations that I had. And I'd only see them on weekends, and they were a couple of years older than me, and they'd find themselves in getting into a bit of trouble, and I'd want to sort of half tag along. And then there was one day when we were all riding our skateboards, and we went down to the next neighbourhood, which probably wasn't that far away, but when you're a kid, it seems a long way away. And we were sitting there, and I can remember it because we were smoking, and I was trying to.
What were you smoking?
It was the Winnie Reds, I reckon.
Yeah.
And I'd never smoked really. I think I'd pinched my mum's pack of smokes at one stage, but I grew up with both my mum and dad smoked, and we're sitting there, and I was trying to pretend I was drawing back and all that sort of stuff. And anyway, there's a group of kids coming the other way, and I could sense there was a different mindset with my mates than what there had been when we were growing up. And the kids coming the other way, and it was clear there was going to be a bit of confrontation between them. And we lined each other up, and I remember ducking in behind. I had a mate, Russell Stratton, who was a big, strong guy, the best footballer, the best everything, really. His daughter, actually, Brooke Stratton, is now an Olympian, which is fantastic, long jumper. And ducking in behind him, but then this kid come out of the other group, and I can remember it because he had a Slade T-shirt on. It was one of those flocked Slade, but I reckon the A was missing or something was missing in on his T-shirt. And he came out of the group and he hit me, and then I hit the ground, and he started kicking.
Hit you in the face or
right in the head? Yeah.
Ooh.
And I reckon it was because you'd mucked around with your mates and you sort of half punch each other, you half getting wrestles, playing Batman and Robin or whatever it was growing up. But this was just something physically so different. It was just bone on. It was just fist on head crunch. And I hit the ground, and he started kicking into me. And I remember lying on the ground and thinking, why isn't this hurting? And anyway, there's a bit of a fight between these kids. And I as the fight went on, I just took off. I grabbed my skateboard and I just took off. And one of my closest mates, Mick Brownlee's only a little guy, and he chased after me and grabbed me and said, "It's all right, mate. It's all right, mate." And I remember thinking to myself, it'll never fucking be all right. It'll never be all right. It was like I'd shamed myself. And I knew that, and my take on it was that this kid had picked me off as the sort of the weakest link in the whole thing. And I was younger, and I was also physically immature. I was a bit of a podgy kid. And I basically resigned myself that, and I had my favourite T-shirt on. The Golden Breed was the big brand at the time, and everyone loved Golden Breed. If you had a Golden Breed T-shirt, you were pretty cool. And because he'd whacked me in the head, I had blood all over it, and I went home that night, snuck in the back of our house, and I took my Golden Breed T-shirt off, and I snuck it in my school bag. And the next day I had to go to school, and I was walking up Mont Albert Road, like Mount Waverley and Canterbury were like two different worlds at that stage. Going to Campbell Grammar felt like going to Hogwarts. It just was so different. It was very strict, school uniforms, calling the teachers sir, all this stuff. And taught me some great stuff. Schooling wasn't never a great experience, but I know it isn't for a lot of people at that stage. But definitely I owe the school a lot, particularly the writing piece, I think. And I was walking up Mont Albert Road, and I snuck up one of the streets, and I grabbed my Golden Breed T-shirt and stuck it in a drain. Oh. And it was like I was closing off that part of who I was.
Yeah.
Because I didn't think I could compete. I didn't think I could keep up.
Yeah.
I couldn't play the games. I mean, when we were walking home that day, it was like these guys were almost planning to meet up with those kids the next week, and I knew but they were having the conversation. It was like I wasn't part, and I knew I wasn't part of that. And then years later, because I've thought about that story and I started writing about it, and I rang Michael, my mate, who told me it was going to be all right. And
that's Mick
and
Brownlee.
Mick Brownlee, yeah.
Little Mick Brownlee.
Little Mick, yeah.
Listening in probably.
And he was actually in hospital when I rang him because he'd come off his mountain bike. And I said, I just want to talk about a story from our childhood. And he said, oh, you want to talk about the fight? Like, without me even asking. And I said, how'd you know? He said, because I tell people, I talk about that fight all the time. Because he loves his footy, he's around footy clubs, and people knew that he knew me, and he said, I said, why do you tell the story? He said, because I tell people Cameron's the sort of person who puts himself out there. He said, because you did it that day. Well, it was the total opposite of my memory of it.
Mm.
So his memory of it is that I'm someone who puts myself out there, whereas my memory is one of shame and being picked off. And just the difference, based on just the stories we tell ourselves, and probably it took me a while to start telling myself a different story, really. And I reckon there's times I slip back into that. And
like when you were sacked.
Yeah, when I was sacked, yeah, definitely.
I don't even like that word. I don't even know why I said it. Because
it's a funny word, isn't it?
Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah, so there are different times, but I think I now can deal with things, and it took me a long time, in relatively healthy ways. I've got this, and it actually was when I was studying fine art that I read a thing about Michelangelo, and he, in his notebooks, he wrote ancora imparo pretty much every day, ancora imparo. Yeah, right, and he lived a long life, right to the end of his life, like in his 80s. And ancora imparo is I'm still learning. So it's one of the things I write each day. And so even the process of writing, or the process of setbacks, or the process of challenging times, which is the inevitability of life, really, is whatever lesson you learn, it is that. It's something to learn, so...
It's something you can be guaranteed of every day. There's always something to be learned. And something that you're about to learn now, Cameron, is that we do need to go to a break. But before we do, I'm going to take up a little extra time because I read something about, one of your mantras of never forgetting how hard it is.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, is it equally as important to recognise that how easy it can be as well? Is easier? Easy is a good thing too.
Yeah, the quote's mainly related to people who take on leadership roles. Yeah, that say, as a coach now and someone who teaches leadership, it'd be very easy for me to sit in judgment of the people who I'm coaching or leading, or particularly because majority of the things I talk about is, or we end up having conversations about, are the things that they're naturally challenged by. And I remember the quote for the first time. It was Chris Scott, who was coaching Geelong, and when he was appointed coach, one of his mantras was, "I'm never going to forget how hard the game is to play," and so it's mainly as it relates to how hard it is to lead. You're only leading if you're dealing in ambiguity, because you don't need leadership if it's obvious. You actually. You are only, if you're leading and it's obvious, well, you're probably doing someone else's job for them.
Yeah, I guess what I mean, even when you referenced Ron Barassi before, leading with such love, and I think about, some of my peers, or even, people that have helped me along the way, and I was late to university in life, and I remember our lecturers describing how difficult the space was to get into and how hard it was going to be. And then my own experience was actually quite the opposite. And I think working hard doesn't mean hard work.
No.
And it doesn't mean that it feels terrible. It brings an incredible amount of joy and feelings of accomplishment when you do push yourself a bit harder, and it does hurt a little bit.
Yeah,
it's not... That doesn't mean it's hard. It's I think there's just many ways we can reframe that.
No, and I think it's worth reframing too, because they're sort of hard fun in some ways. Look, the writing piece is always hard because it's much easier to scroll than write. Or there's always easier things to do, and it's a going to the gym is not that hard, but it's going to be hard at some point. But we understand the benefits of it. There's a wonderful thing I heard recently. It was from Abby Wambash, who's...
I was going to say Wombat.
Yeah, it's a bit Wambash. I think it's actually spelled like that too, Wambash. She's a famous American football or soccer player, maybe the best ever. And when she retired, you talked about ideas of identity, and she genuinely struggled with that, like most elite athletes will struggle with it one way or another. And she started writing down what are the things in life that make me feel good about me. She'd write at the top of the page, and I do this with leaders a fair bit. A majority of them are the result of something of which they've had to work pretty hard. Hard in the inverted commas, as in they've had to. It's testing, it's challenging, it's difficult. They've had to push themselves. They've had to find something. They've had to build habits, rituals, systems. They've designed systems for themselves to make it easier. All the sort of the hard thinking as well as the hard doing to create the outcome which makes them feel good about them. And I quite like that, whether it's, I know even the art, I enjoy it when I'm in there, but it doesn't stop me getting distracted and want to do something else or do nothing, or, most of the things you end up having to do is in response to, and you feel good best about, is something that you genuinely believe you've had to make an effort to get good at, or to, no different to cooking or to, a better meal is the one that you've worked towards. It's, takeaway's cool and Uber Eats is cool, but
it's what happens around it, though. If you're getting Uber Eats and you're surrounded by really cool friends and you're having great conversation, well, then that's...
Yeah, or even just cooking for yourself sometimes, I find, that same thing, where you just go, I'm happy I did. I'm glad I did that,
Yeah.
I don't want to clean up now, but I'm glad I did that.
Well, speaking of hard things, writing this radio show isn't, a walk in the park, no, but it's always such a joy for me because I get to learn. Every single guest I have on this show, I know I'm going to learn not something, but a whole range of things. And, for me, it's a little bit self-indulgent from that respect. But, radio's always been a passion of mine. I love everything about radio and so glad I was, at an early age able to connect with that passion. But we are at our next very special guest song request, Cameron. And this corresponding cryptic clue this time goes... how you might feel being here today.
I might feel being here today.
How you might feel being here today. I have to qualify that.
I'm only thinking I'm feeling good.
Or you could feel like something relating to your gender.
No, you've got me.
You could be a lucky man.
No, the lucky man, yeah, the lucky man. I could be a very lucky man. Yeah, I should have thought of that.
So maybe you weren't feeling lucky. There's probably a song called An Unlucky Man as well.
Yeah, there probably is. Yeah. No, this is a good tune.
This is the verb. So you're going to tell us about that when we come back?
Yeah, sure.
All right, everyone. You are listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC. Don't go away. To 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC with Rae Bonney, and I'm joined by Cameron Schwab. Amongst all the many things, he's the founder and CEO of Design CEO. They're a tailored learning experience for CEOs and senior leaders navigating the unique hardness and ambiguity of modern leadership. The fact that I could get all those words out.
Yeah, good words.
I mean, I have been relying on Wikipedia. You've got an amazing website, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
It's really well done. Anyone wanting to check it out. It's not just a website about what Cameron does. If you're interested in getting some leadership development coaching or whatever, but he's got all of his amazing creative stuff on there as well. So, and it's very well set out too.
Thanks.
So there you go. There's a bit of feedback. Speaking of feedback, we have had a few people chime in as well. Jenny Thorpe, who is long-term friend of mine and also supporter of the show, said, "What an interesting story. I could listen to him for hours." What about me, Jenny? Could you listen to me for hours? Okay. Mike Hagan. In fact, Mike, I was just talking to Cameron about you in the break and your amazing foray into your true passion, which is mental health. And Mike said, "Great show, Rae. What a humble guy." So There you go. People listening in all over the world enjoying the life and stories of Cameron Schwab.
Well, thank you.
So
Thanks for
Cameron.
people listening, eh?
Cameron,
It's cool.
what does it feel like being you today?
What's it feel like being me today? No, I'm in a pretty good place, actually. And that the song Lucky Man is probably one of the reasons, which is... So that the band The Verve, particularly the song Bittersweet Symphony, which is just a great tune. That was actually potentially one of them. But so that song, when my youngest was born, who came into the world as Lockie, I used to sing it as Lockie Man, you're a lucky man, you know, and that's why that song is. So this is in reference to Lockie, who's now Evie. Yeah, so Lockie transitioned when she was 17. Yeah, so...
and she's now 23?
24,
24.
Yeah, and it's going really well, and, you know, it was unbelievable courage and gets to be the person she wants to be, and in a way where it's like a reflection of who she is, and it's like all young people growing up. That's a challenge and a journey in itself, and then there's obviously another layer with that, and obviously there's moments within it all. But I was listening to a talk the other day, and it was just a dinner with a partner and Cecily, my wife, and I just had this overwhelming sense of pride. It was just this. Well, I almost couldn't talk. I didn't need to talk. I was just listening to the three of them talk, and just thinking, it's way different to what I ever thought it was going to be. But you know, it's one of my favourite lines, because when she transitioned, I wasn't sure how to parent my kid, basically. And
was that a complete surprise for you, or you had some insight?
No, it was a surprise, but it's not. I was surprised, but it wasn't surprising. I don't know if that makes sense. That it was going to probably be. It was probably going to be something other than the pathway you guess, if you like. You know, even. You know, I think there's a certain assumption you make. You have a child, they'll go to primary school, they'll go to secondary school, they'll go to university, they'll find a career, they'll meet a partner, they'll get married, they'll have kids, and one day you'll be a grandfather or whatever it might be. You know, that we think that somehow that's how it's going to be. But
imagine how many people have had to suffer that trajectory as well.
Yeah, that's right, in ways which definitely, no doubt. And so it wasn't that, but even in the study and the work I did, and it's to really find out how I could be the best parent for her during that period, and I had to learn a lot, and it's been a gift, is, you know, the Brené Brown quote, you know, you build the child for the path, not the path for the child, or the quote that she talks of, I'm not sure if it's hers or not, but which I really love, and what I suppose the sense of pride was that, the child had been built and is still building, obviously at 24, we've got a lot of building to do still, but it was just an overwhelming sense of pride, and I felt that often, but it might be that I'm getting a bit older now, and a sense that she's going to be okay, when there were times when I wasn't sure she would be, and she'll work stuff out for herself, and so that song, you know, was, even though she's not a Lockie anymore, and by the way, I don't tell her story, she tells her own. I just talk of my role as her parent, and even to the extent where it's okay that I use her old name, and Evie was the name she was going to be if she was born a girl. So that was just when she made that choice, it was because there was a little bit of grieving in the loss of the name, I must admit. You know, when I realised I wasn't going to have a Lockie anymore, and then to have an Evie, and Evie fits better than Lockie. You know, it just does.
Yeah. Did you, you know, if I think back to about when you were a little boy and your dad coming in after work with his scotch and cigarette breath, and sitting on your bed telling you stories and stuff like that, and you know, footy. Did you have that same idea that you and Lockie, when Evie was Lockie, that you would have that kind of football relationship?
Yeah, I assumed that there'd be something about football, but very early in the piece, that wasn't going to be a thing. And also, I separated from her mum when she was only very little, and so there was probably always going to be some challenges with that. But I thought sport would always be in there somewhere at some stage. She'd find whatever a sport was, and we would have a thing. And there were times when, because you go to Auskick, you go to play soccer, and I reckon she was about 8 or 9, and we're watching her play. Might have been younger, playing soccer, and she just had no interest in the fact that the ball might be coming in her direction. Whereas, I remember when I was a kid, I just couldn't take my eye off the ball, and it might have been that I realised that I wasn't going to be fast enough or quick enough potentially, and so I had to work out a different way of playing, like you do. But she didn't care at all. She was actually skipping at one stage and doing stuff and all that, and I remember someone yelled out at her, concentrate or something like that. I remember looking at him thinking,
maybe she was destined for sport administration.
I think she's just destined to be her, and she gets to be this reflection of whatever it is, all her interests now, and they're still evolving and changing. And if we had this conversation in 10 years' time, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of twists and turns. But she's clever and she's articulate, she's funny. She's got great relationships. Stuff's just starting to work out, having already come to terms with perhaps more challenges than most 24-year-olds have had to deal with in their own way. But although I would say that being 24, as much as people like to think it's somehow easier, everyone thinks it's easier being 24 now than what it was then. But I think it's actually way more complicated. But
I think it's just different, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just different. Yeah, I think it's the best.
There was a question I had for you before about, listening to your story about being a 12-year-old getting your face punched in, and after you've been forced to chug down a Winnie Red. And then not wanting to sound catastrophist, but, hearing that story the other day about that man who died at Sunshine train station.
Terrible.
What are your thoughts about how these kinds of social issues have evolved? If you go back to gangs then and gangs now.
I think, like any... It's always a fine line, isn't it? We use the word culture. Well, culture is probably a take on the word cult, so you can be in a really strong culture, but is it a cult? Sporting clubs, the idea of culture can become quite culty in its own way as well. But I think there's a desperate and absolute human need to belong and to be a part of something. But I think there's a big difference between fitting in and belonging. I think there's a big difference. And I think probably at different times I just tried to fit in, like I was in those Saturday mornings, Sunday mornings with my mates from Mount Waverley. I still wanted to fit in, but all of a sudden realising I probably didn't belong anymore in its own way. And I think Evie spent her childhood trying to fit in, and now she belongs. And I think there's probably, even with gangs, and I've got no expertise in this area whatsoever, other than probably having experiences with that need and want to belong to something. And now doing work on my own, I think that the thing I miss more than anything about not being a CEO of a football club, even though you were quite isolated in the role, I did feel like I belonged to something.
Well, you're turning up, aren't you?
Yeah, well, you're belonging to something which, in the case of an AFL club, is the Melbourne Football Club was the originators of the game itself.
But the human connection as well is so critical, and we forget that we're chemical beings that actually need to be doing this. And we saw a lot of it during COVID in all of our isolation, how the human condition adapted so well, but in other respects
struggled.
It really did with loneliness, people don't know, is one of the biggest killers of people. And
I think and often we can only be one step away from that too. That's a breakup of a long-term relationship can put you into that space very
and a long-term
immediately.
relationship can be your job that you that you identify
that's
with.
a good
that
way of thinking.
It's they're very similar when we look at the grief and loss process.
Yeah.
That we forget to apply that to all kinds of things, like even the loss of Lockie and the creation of Evie. There's one and then there's the other. And I had a question for you actually, and this is, I guess, for parents who experience the same thing as you. Do you speak about Lockie as Lockie when Lockie was Lockie and then Evie, or?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So even when I was talking then, I'm thinking I'm slipping in and out of which it is. So it would normally, because Lockie was a boy who went to school and had teachers and had mates, and then Lockie became Evie. So, but I talk of her as she in
that context.
In most contexts, when she was, that was like when she was a boy almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she's okay with that?
Yeah, I think so. It gets confusing, obviously, but she's so often, even in having conversations, you might contextualise the content of the conversation. So if you and I are having a conversation about just anything, we do bring context in all sorts of subtle ways into that. Like I grew up in Mount Waverley and this happened. So you've given it context. I'm 59, so therefore, so you're giving, and then you talk to the specifics of the content.
Because you weren't always 59, were you?
No.
Yeah,
so you frame it in that way.
Yes.
So
that's a really good way of putting it, Cameron. Thank you. That's helped me sort that out in my own peculiar mind.
well, almost anything we deal with has both. So, like if you're dealing with you have to face into a decision. Well, the decision has context and it has content.
Yeah.
If it's the fifth time it's happened, well, the context is different than if it's the first time it's happened. And that might be just a bit of my CEO coming out of me.
Well, yes. When I was reading your stuff, it sounds like that's all I've been doing. I do work as well. I get up at very early in the morning though. I just noticed a lot of your very deep and creative writing occurred in the first half of 2022.
Yeah, I set myself a challenge, and I'm still in it, to write 40 lessons about my first 40 years of work, and I got up to about 17. And so I had a really good run, and I think you do go in and out of those phases. So I'm rebuilding. I did another one recently, but my goal is to get 40 pieces of writing out. Yeah.
I just thought, because people, I do encourage you to read them, because they're just so incredibly raw and deep, and the emotions that like and I was crying. In one in particular, that how it's not like I set myself a goal of writing 10 lessons in a year. It's more like, how do you can't just pull that out of your hat, can you?
No, I've got there's a little I can't remember where I heard it now, but if you're overthinking, read. If you're overthinking, if you're underthinking, read. If you're underthinking, listen to a podcast. Underthinking, put yourself in conversation with someone. But if you're overthinking, write. I can't think of any other way to draw yourself back into some form of clarity of thought. And
did somebody tell you that, or did you learn that yourself?
I think most things I've stolen from someone.
But that's life. We have to learn. That's how we evolve, isn't it?
So one of my favourite sayings, which I think is mine, I'm not saying, so it can't be saying because I only say it. So it's, I suppose if it's one person saying it, it's a saying. But is borrow freely, apply uniquely. So borrow from wherever you can, but learn to apply it. And so what you're doing is, even in this conversation now, so I'll learn something from you. So I draw on your knowledge, but my application of it then becomes my wisdom. If I say, like Brené Brown's, child for the path for the child is a piece of knowledge which is available to all of us, but its application was when, I had to reassess parenting in those circumstances. So it's the thoughtfulness which then goes into it. So the writing I do, and I do constrain it. You deliberately have to constrain it. And so the metaphor I draw on is the metaphor that I can back up. So that's by virtue of we all live a limited life in our own way. So for me, it's obviously sport, but it's mostly AFL. And my experiences, both growing up in the game and as a CEO in the game and a recruiter. Art, because of the, that learning to create enough space inside the writing and the drawing for people to have the experience that perhaps you had, as in they see themselves inside it in one way or another. I think the parenting metaphor is a really powerful one, because it's probably all of those things in its own way, and it happens to most of us relatively young in life, and we're not anything other than fully formed, but we have a child's expectation that we are. And I often think about my mum at that stage, particularly where, my father was a challenging person, and she had 3 kids really young in life, and
she was a kid herself.
And I didn't think of her as that at all until there was only some understanding of it, because you realise your mum was like 10 years younger than any other mum.
Better looking than all the other mums.
And that just made the mums 26 when they were having their kids, which is still young by today's today's I suppose expectations. Yes. Wrong word, but so even in that context, so you draw on those things, and the storytelling. People remember stories; they forget data and they forget other things. And
always remember a story.
You remember a story, yeah. So one of the things even I teach in the leadership work I do is for people to mine their stories, dig them out. What are your 4 or 5 most, profound stories of your life, and just put on headphones, play music from the time. So if I'm writing about when I was young, I've got Suzi Quatro playing. I've got the Sweet playing. I've got Kiss playing. I've got all the music I grew up with playing.
Well, I can't wait to get Hot August Night, because that, as you said, that build up bit of Hot August Night, that is the first thing I'm doing when I get in the car after this show.
And you'll be tapping the steering wheel all the way home. You will, and you'll have if you can't do a great good Lord, where you're not singing it out properly, And there's one stage where Neil Diamond says, "I'm singing for you, tree people." When he's talking to the people who are hanging off the trees at the at the concert. I'm singing for you, tree people, as well.
Yeah, gosh,
it's a beautiful line.
Again, what a powerful person. We are now at 32 minutes past 11. We've got like 28 minutes left of the show, Cameron. So we've got a little bit more to cover. Cool. I think you're going to have to come back. I say that to all my guests, though. When they come on, it's like 2 hours. That's a really long show. You go, you'll be surprised how quickly that goes.
There's plenty to talk about.
So I had so many more questions in that segment. We can carry them over, though. But now we're coming up to our third very special guest song request. And again, the cryptic clue. Can you guess this one? Hallelujah.
Yeah, it'd be Jeff Buckley.
It would be. Yeah. I wondered if you'd get that one, actually. Yeah. I think that he does the best version.
He just does. There's a great Keith Richards line, the Rolling Stones guitarist, who's like freak of nature that he's still alive. Because when they first played, they were a cover band. They just basically played American blues music, and so it would almost be considered cultural appropriation in some ways now. But he has a line, it's not where you take it from, it's where you take it to that counts. And so Jim Croce's version is just outstanding, but that's not Jim Croce, it's had a brain fade. But there's no doubt that the Jeff Buckley version of it is just outstanding. So I've just totally stuffed up who wrote that.
Oh, look, he's Googling now. The CEO in him can't stand to not know.
It's one of my favourites.
Well, we'll go to a break, and when we come back, Cameron is going to... Leonard Cohen. There you go. Everyone can breathe.
It was the C which got me. I love Leonard Cohen, by the way.
All right, when we come back, we're going to we've got a few more things to cover, and we're going to wrap the show. So don't go away. You're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC. Welcome back. You're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC. You're listening to Rae Bonney and Cameron Schwab. He's a CEO, leadership mentor, writer, storyteller, artist, and a prostate cancer survivor. We haven't covered that one yet, Cameron.
No, that's...
Now, what year was that?
So it was at the very start of COVID, actually. It was because it was even when I had surgery, there was actually concern that I mightn't be able to have it because all the doctors and surgeons all of a sudden become on call and going into hospital, and so you couldn't have visitors, and you're not in hospital for a long time with it. It's pretty rugged surgery, I've got to say, but much more. It's a there's a lot in it. Obviously, there's a lot of layers in something like that, but you go in perfectly healthy and then you come out unhealthy. It really is sort of the experience, because I was fit, strong.
Yeah.
I've maintained a pretty good fitness routine probably for most of my life, but particularly the last 15 or so years. And then you come out and you've had an organ cut out, and parts of you don't function anymore, and you've got to rebuild all that. It's I think it's pretty underestimated. I saw recently where it was someone had been diagnosed and had to take time off work, and they said, they're going to cut the tumour out and he'll come back in 6 weeks' time. And I'm thinking, gee,
No.
It's not a tumour. You're taking an organ out, and you cannot make any assumptions on how people are going to bounce back. And whilst the surgery and the methodology and the people who do it are they're unbelievably talented and experienced people. It is one of the, I'd say it ranks as one of the most difficult experiences of my life.
Yeah, well, we still haven't caught up. It's you just mentioned prostate cancer survival is just so much better than it used to be. However, we still haven't caught up with how do we manage the dignity and the pride and all that stuff that happens afterwards. It's like, yes, let's celebrate survival, but what's left afterwards still isn't being acknowledged.
That is, because you get tests and your tests are clear, but you still know that you've got to work through all the other stuff. But so the Jeff Buckley song was so as I mentioned, the all of the music I've chosen is as it relates to important relationships in my life, and the most important is with my wife Cecily, and it was when we first started seeing each other and getting to know each other and all that sort of stuff. I was listening to a fair bit of Jeff Buckley at the time, and he has a wonderful album called Grace, which Alleluia's on. But Jeff Buckley died when he was 27, I think. And there was just a whole lot of recordings which he was in the middle of working his way through. And one of them they put together, I think his mother might have put together the recordings. I think the album's called My Sweetheart the Drunk or something like that.
Gosh.
Yeah, My Sweetheart the Drunk. Yeah. And it's quite random, and some of them are really unproduced, and so you're not even sure what would have ended up on an album, what didn't.
Yeah.
But that one's relatively well produced, and I love the song, but Cecily really loved the song. Yeah. And even because I did ask her, I said, which song do you think defines us? And I played a few, and and as soon as I played it, she started moving to it. Yeah, so that's the one.
Well, she's listening in right now. So hello, Cecily.
Yeah.
Thank you for all your beautiful care of Cameron.
Yeah, no doubt. And so it was and we've had to travel through some stuff together, and went to Perth together and lived over there, and it was relatively early in our relationship, and we took some chances, and I had to become a stepfather of her daughter Chrissy, and I think she also, because in the song it's everybody here wants you is one of those lines, and I think there's probably also an element of that's how she felt that she was competing with a lot of things,
for you, do you have a piece of you?
Yeah, because we'd recently gone over to Perth. I'm CEO of a footy club which is struggling, and I really went into it full on, and I also had a history before coming into it. I'd been married before. There's all of those elements, the complexities.
And it is the other side of the world almost, isn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was an unbelievable experience, and we loved it, and it was probably the most enjoyable period I had in footy. One of the hardest. They were all pretty tough, because you were travelling a lot and you were away from home, and during that period of time Lockie was here, and so there was that complexity as well. But I'm really glad that's a song we chose, because because I see the sparkle in her eyes with that song, and she's got beautiful sparkling eyes. Yeah.
Well, you showed me a photo just before of her and your stepdaughter Chrissy, and how they look like sisters, and then a photo of you giving Chrissy away at her wedding, which obviously that's all worked out very well if that's a role that you've taken. But what a beautiful looking family. Yeah,
no, they are, and she's got a wonderful husband. One Pablo Grimaldi Ferrari. He's Chilean, and he's called Pampa, and he's just a wonderful young guy who he's got great energy too, and hard work, and he's ambitious, but he's humble, and they're a wonderful couple. So they're going making their own lives and doing their own thing, but we're all very aligned in life. Yeah.
I don't know how you feel about this, Cameron, but the world says one thing, but I think that people are mostly good.
No, definitely, yeah.
And, you know, I don't think we open our eyes so much. Like, even when you're talking about Jeff Buckley, he died at 27. What he left and what he produced while he was here is still reverberating. No, every day that gives people joy, that has some kind of anchor for your relationship. It's just like the power of people is just, it's spine tingling. And I think that's why I love the work that I do so much, is because it's just about people, and it makes me one of the luckiest people in the world to unpack that, every day.
Yeah, and it is and I think, and you probably find this in the work you do, is that most people are working or responding to something which is happening for them. In like when you see the worst of people, in most cases there's something going on, and we do find ourselves in just unbelievably complex. There's no good resolution circumstance, and and even when we see, people respond in racist ways, sexist ways, all of those, things which are clearly so painful, particularly for people on the other side of that, is I think the danger is we just go, you're one of them, I'm one of these. We isolate people. We don't, I think a lot of it, even happened in the US, where you became something but not the other, where most of the best work happens in that little space in between, where people can reach out and seek to understand and try and find out why people think the way they do. And you don't change people's minds by calling them, like even the word woke, like woke used to be a good word. It used to show that you were aware and you're sensitive.
Awake.
You're awake, yeah. Whereas now it's sort of seen as this thing, oh, you're so woke. I go, well, okay, I'm okay to be that then, because I understand my definition of woke is that. But by actually saying you're this and you're that, it takes all of the nuance out of it to actually really work out why people think the way that they do.
Well, that's definitely why I have my trademark question, what does it feel like being you today? Because what is it, is something, but a feeling is something that you can produce at any moment, and today is the moment rather than any particular other time. So it really nails down being able to identify with oneself or with a person is, what is it right now that you're feeling, rather than me subjectively labelling you with whatever I think you are, whether you're a racist or you're a radio presenter, or because when I leave here, I'm not going to be a radio presenter. You don't know what I'm going to be next. No. I'm probably going to be a mother next.
Yeah.
when I get Rory out of bed. Rory, if you can hear me, I've got Google Home on outside his bedroom. Get out.
That is, and even that the feeling thing, and I mentioned context and content before, but we wake up to our feelings and our thinking, if you like, which often is in a response to. So that's what's happening inside you in those moments, which is often in response to something which is happening around you in one way or another. So, which again has context and content to it.
Yes.
But how we actually take ourselves from that into a place where we can actually show up and be a mother, we can show up and be a CEO, we can show up and be a husband, we can show up and be a parent. And that's not saying that we have to put on a mask or something like that, but we do have to create systems for ourselves which enable us to get better at those things. And
how much mask wearing did you have to wear during your CEO years?
As someone who was dealing with depression all the time, yeah, very much. But mask wearing might be the wrong definition, I'd say.
Or how much could you not show of yourself?
I couldn't tell.
What would have happened if you did disclose?
Maybe not as much as I feared, maybe. But
who did you confide in?
My wife,
yeah.
Pretty much it. I was terrified about people finding out. I was in, because I've received regular treatment for the last 20 years of my life, longer. And I can actually remember being in a waiting room where someone did recognise me in the room who was clearly really struggling in life or had something going on, because I was on the back page of the Herald Sun, and he recognised me. He was a Demon supporter, and I remember him, because I wear glasses, and he drew on the back page of the Herald Sun and made my eyes cross-eyed and laughed and showed me. It was just one of those unusual things that happen in life, you know. And it was funny, and we both had like a belly laugh, two midlife blokes laughing in a waiting room of a clinic. But then it was, I hope he doesn't ring SEN tomorrow. There was that feeling. And I assume in the end I become less protective of it, or less secretive about it, but I never said it in an absolute sense. But it also coincided with having to deal with, all of a sudden our players were becoming more, we had to talk about it. Like if a player couldn't play on the weekend, you know, very rarely would players not play because they were struggling with a mental health issue. That was just suck it up, buddy. You know, you just get out there and play. But players started to not, and we had a sensitivity towards it and all of those things. And we had players who did start to talk openly about, you know, their challenges in regard to that. But I think it was always different for a player than it was for a CEO, because it was the player, as long as you can go and get a kick and kick a goal and play on your opponent or whatever it was. Whereas my sense was that people would question my judgment and, you know, am I fit for this role type stuff.
Yeah. We look at what's going on for Alistair Clarkson at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, what does it feel like being him? You know, there's many labels you could put on him, but when, you know, it reportedly going to a petrol station and not being served because of, you know, the assumptions around, you know, things.
No, we had a period of our life, and one I can't. The worst thing you should do is actually say, I know how it feels like, because you don't know what's going on for someone else. But I was at Melbourne when we were investigated for tanking games, and that was the worst experience of my working life, and because it just seemed like it was you're just surrounded by it wherever you went, and it felt like you couldn't leave the house, or you were just in dread of what was going to end up in the paper the next day, or you just couldn't have a normal conversation. I think it was, you could be talking about the weather, but somehow that was sort of like sitting there in one way or another. And again, that wasn't a healthy period. And you just wanted to get it out of the road, not in a way which was fair, but just in a way which enabled people to move on. And so it becomes a transaction rather than anything else. So so when you're the subject of very high external judgment, there's all forms of unfairness and disinformation and challenge inside that, of which you have no capacity to correct or be, but you just have to somehow weather it in a way. It goes back to the Ancora Imparo. You know, did I handle that period of my life as well as I could have? Well, clearly I didn't. And so what have I learnt from it? Well, I'll probably find that I won't do it again, but
No, it's a big topic, and I can see that we could, you know, there's so much more to that discussion. But unfortunately, we only have 6 minutes left of the show, and I was expecting Paula Hogg to come in this afternoon to take over next at 12 noon with her show Lazy Sunday Afternoon, but I think I just saw somebody else move into studio too, so not entirely sure what's coming up next at 12, but I just wanted to remind our listeners, if any of our discussions today have brought up uncomfortable feelings for listeners, please remember support is there. A few options for crisis support or even just support in general. Lifeline is very good, 131114. The suicide callback service is 1300 659 467, and of course emergency services is 000. I'll be back next month on Sunday the 18th of June, and I'll be sharing the studio with none other than Ollie Bridge. He's a world contributor in many ways, also originally trained as a sport and exercise scientist at the University of Bath at the English Institute of Sport, and has worked with the likes of Jensen Button, Mark Webber at Benetton, Renault, Formula One and the British Olympic gymnastics team. So he's going to be a great interview. But Cameron, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming in today and sharing everything with me before the show and hopefully after the show as well. We'll continue these conversations.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you for the opportunity. I've really appreciated it.
It's a pleasure. And of course, this show will be reproduced on my YouTube channel later when I get around to that. One final special guest song request, Cameron. This one won't be difficult, but I may as well give you a cryptic clue anyway. Here it is. The last 2 hours have not felt like this.
Long, long, long.
That's the one. And that is by the Beatles. The Beatles. Now, that's another group that's just blessed the world with just so much more than they probably ever imagined.
Yeah, no doubt.
Well, take care, everyone. Have a great Sunday, and we'll see you next month.
So just quick one. This is for my sister. Yeah, my sister Jenny. Yeah,
Jenny, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
This is
so
for you.
She was she in music. So she. I remember walking past her bedroom door when I was a kid, and it was always shut because she's an older sister, and I could hear this music coming out. And I knocked on the door asking what it was, and it was John Lennon singing Instant Karma. And from that point onwards, I just loved the Beatles and everything. And this is a George Harrison song, Long, Long, Long. And it's probably as little known as any Beatles song, but it's probably my favourite. It's a little bit of a yearning, loving song, yearning for love song. So
great. Well, this is for Jenny.
Not that part is specific to Jen, but just she's gifted me with my love of music. Yeah.
Wow, that's a nice one to go out on, and probably never heard here on 3WBC before, the Beatles with Long, Long, Long. Take care, everyone.